Hi, everybody, and welcome to a Saturday night here in Dublin, in Ireland. It is 10:42 p.m., and I'm afraid to announce that I have a couple of glasses of red wine on board. Not too much, though, and I hope it's not unprofessional, but I said I would turn up to read a chapter every night, and I'm damned if I'm going to give up on it tonight, so I've been actually very good. I said to my wife recently, I said, I'm going to have a glass of wine. We, by the way, only drink at the weekends. Because I had been having one, two, and the third one is always a bad idea, but it's great at the time. It doesn't seem to bother my beloved. But anyway, I said to myself, I've got to cut back. And I have been quite good. Now, tonight, I had one and a good bit. No, I wouldn't even say two. Chapter 18 is where we're at. Sorry to see war breaking out again in Israel tonight. Not going to get all political about that, but I will say I was present as a 2 or 3-year-old in the 1967 in the 6-Day War. I was there. My dad was stationed out there. And I remember there were, made in France, they were Israeli jets. They were called Mirage. And the roofs in wherever I was, because I was extensively in the Middle East. So it could have been Lebanon, it could have been Syria. Well, it wasn't Syria. It could have been Israel, Jordan, whatever, but these jets flew across the top of the house. I mean, the noise and the speed, but fast and all as they were, one of my earliest childhood memories is I could see the rivets underneath the wings. You know, somebody show me a picture of a French Mirage jet on the internet. I bet you there's rivets underneath the wings. Rivets, I could see them. Now that's sounding like I have 2 glasses of wine on board, and I don't mean it to be. I quite liked last night's chapter. I know there was 1 or 2 of you probably present. I'm sorry to say I did not. I like to skim across a chapter so I have an idea what's coming, but no, I've not had that kind of a day. No. Before you write me off as another drunken Irishman, I'd say put that out of your mind. We're going to bed now, and we're on chapter 18, Destiny of Service. 1/4 the population of the globe, 1/4 the land surface of the earth. That is the British Empire. What are we to make of it? Mr. Churchill announced, I did not become His Majesty's First Minister in order to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. That's how I sound at the moment. But the waxing and waning of empires are governed by forces more cosmic than the words or even the decisions of men who occupy the seats of human greatness at one time or the next. The imponderable and immeasurable spiritual force which surrounds and controls this universe has stretched out its hand from the unseen to lift man's empires up and then to cast them down again, according as they have served or disobeyed its purposes. I got a first-hand impression of the British Commonwealth of Nations from Indians. They came to Brighton in the last war to recover from their wounds. They were given, as hospital, the pavilion which George IV built. He used it for cards, wine, and women. With the help of Mrs. Fitzherbert, Lady Hertford, Sheridan, and Fox, he turned the fishing village into a society den. More than 100 years later, in Gentleman George's pavilion, the smell of disinfectant and disease was substituted for the scent of powder and port wine. The Indians bore terrible wounds. Some had lost both legs. Some had both arms blasted away. They were pushed around in the bath chairs, which before that war had taken rich dyspeptics for their daily ventilation. They were brave and kind men, those Indians. Their keen faces were patient under pain. They used to smile and talk with me, and wave as they were wheeled by. It was gossip in Brighton that religion forbade one or two of them the use of anesthetics and antiseptics, so they faced operations conscious and unafraid, and later had seawater baths to heal their stumps and scars. Whether this rumor was true or false, it colored my childhood picture of India. I thought of Indians as the embodiment of human endurance and chivalry. I grew to love them. Canada, too, is a part of the empire which runs in my blood. My great-grandmother, Sarah Howard, cut her ties with Europe. She crossed the Atlantic in a small wooden sailing ship, taking her children with her. She settled in the Blue Nose coastal belt near Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she educated her children there by sacrifice and sweat. She passed on to them her rugged and obstinate quality. Two of my mother's family emigrated to Australia. From them tales came back of huge sheep ranches, of days spent on horseback, and of campfires and billy can tea. One of my ancestors had been with Livingstone in Africa. My grandmother passed on to me an old letter received from him, with a dark stain on the envelope, which I told myself was blood. I pictured the blackness and heat of the sudden tropical night, with hostile natives, silent and uncanny as jungle beasts, creeping towards the encampment where Livingstone and his companions were sleeping. Livingstone? Livingstone. Inside the tents, Livingstone and his friends were armed, not with guns or grenades, but only with the weapons of indignity and the sword of the spirit to conquer the dark continent. I had a vivid and warm conception of the British Empire as I grew to manhood. It was almost a family affair, and something which no other people throughout history had been able to build in the same way. I was proud of the British Empire. It meant something personal to me. I had a stake in it. I meant to go and look at it one day, and I was stirred by the conception of millions of unknown men and women who never had seen me and whom I never should see, united by the spirit of a common loyalty which was stronger than party treaties or agreements. The British Empire stood to me for adventure, toughness, and character. I saw the commonwealth of nations, rich in gold, copper, pearls, iron, coal, rubber, and cattle, rich in the variety of its tongues, colours, and races, standing as a mighty world force for good against evil. I thought the British Empire was the embodiment of the best things British character stood for: selfless courage, square dealing, equality to all men, help to the underdog, and freedom for the oppressed. As I grew into manhood, my views changed. My conceptions of empire were debunked. Some of the cleverest men I knew, and whom I greatly admired, laughed as loudly at the out-of-date idea that the empire was something to be proud of, as at the out-of-date idea that faithfulness in a home was the done thing. People who accept and propagate this view, intellectuals who lightly discard the great fact of the empire without ever considering what its true destiny should be, are merely the dupes and tools of the destructive forces of materialism. But I did not see this at the time. I did not recognize the war of ideas or realize how decisive a factor in that war an empire dedicated under God to the service of man could be. I met self-styled imperialists. A certain type among them were gross, self-satisfied, and self-indulgent. Their countenances were mottled by overdoses of alcohol, and their lungs corroded by overdoses of nicotine. They regarded themselves as empire builders, but seemed more like those who reap the gain of other men's labours. As I grew up, I was told by my intellectual friends that the empire was merely a cash proposition. We had grabbed it by force. We were in it for what we could get out of it. It was something we ought to be slightly ashamed of. Interest and enthusiasm were definitely not the thing. I was told that Colonel Blimp represented my idea of the empire. Certainly Colonel Blimp, as portrayed by the cartoonist who starred him, was a farcical figure. He appeared most days in the press arrayed in a bath towel. He had a silly face. Also, the things he was given to say were as foolish as possible. He was proud of the empire, which he spelt Empah. E-M-P-A-H. E-M-P-A-H. And this pride was portrayed as one of the most ridiculous things about him. I looked at Blimp. I laughed at him. I did not want to be thought like him. When I met certain men from the empire, I had to face the fact that my old conception of a happy family of nations was shaken. Many of these men were not bound by the same loyalties as myself. Some looked eagerly forward to the day when their countries would break the bonds of empire, as they expressed it. They were critical of the way they had been treated. They felt they had had a raw deal. I lost interest in the empire. It became rather a bore. So did those who wished to discuss it. Then I went to work for Lord Beaverbrook. For a long time he would discuss nothing but the empire. And he certainly was not a bore. He was as boring as a wagon load of gun cotton in a match factory. I suppose Lord Beaverbrook is one of the greatest living imperialists. His enemies may say that reflects on the modern conception of imperialism. Just the same, Lord Beaverbrook is a man with a vision. Like or dislike him, love or loathe his policies, he is one of the few public figures who were not ashamed to keep men's minds fixed on the empire throughout the interwar years. I have seen him spring from a sun-bath in his private garden near Leatherhead to prance about the grass delivering a 20-minute oration on the subject of crown colonies. Then he sinks back on his couch, glares at me for a moment, says, "For God's sake, Peter, when will you learn not to address me as if I were at a public meeting?" and roars with laughter. I have heard him talk about the empire while shaving, while sitting in the dentist's chair, while having his hair cut, and with his mouth full of continental food prepared by his Alsatian chef. He talks about it in French trains. And German liners, in pyjamas and dress clothes, in season and out of season. For me and for millions, Lord Beaverbrook rekindled an interest in the British Empire. But something was missing. In spite of political campaigns, many of them outstandingly successful, in favour of empire-free trade, the problem of India increased and increased. So did the problems of Newfoundland and Jamaica. This conflict between the French and the English in Canada continued to grow nearer. The Dutch and the British still glared at each other in South Africa. Lord Beaverbrook's policy said that Britain's interest lay in a closer economic unity within the empire. And while this may have been true, it neglected the eternal truth that if you represent an interest, you inevitably divide people and arouse the opposition of all those who have other interests. If you represent a principle, you rally the wise and honest to your standard. It was sad and strange that Lord Beaverbrook's Empire programme had cash appeal, but lacked heart appeal, for many who would have been stirred by the heart appeal denounced the cash appeal as selfish or ill-conceived. What did Lord Beaverbrook's imperial policies lack? They lacked the inspiration of a new factor which must enter in if the British Empire is to achieve its true identity. In India recently, a statesman and scholar who is an understanding friend of Britain summed up what he felt was lacking in her administration. After paying a wholehearted tribute to the work of the British people in India, he concluded in their manner of doing it they had proved highly intelligent and immensely insensitive. The same principle is illustrated by the true story of the English woman and the Burmese woman. The English woman said, "Why don't you like us? Look what we have given your country. We have given you railroads and radio and newspapers and steamers and telegraph and law and justice and protection." The Burmese woman replied, "Yes, you certainly have. I am grateful for all of these things. But have you given us your hearts?" She did not mean slush and sentiment. She meant a relationship based on heartfelt equality and respect on both sides, a relationship of mutual caring and esteem by which the two races, side by side, could solve their problems together. It is this lack in British administration which produces the paradox and tragedy. The British civil service have never administered our imperial territories more honourably and ably than during the last 25 years. Yet Britain has never been more unpopular in India and in some other places than today. Nor has her rule been more questioned by democratic nations. The bitterness has grown greatly in the last few years. In India, you feel it in the shops, on the train, in the bus, everywhere. Indeed, it has become so all-pervading that many Indians have now convinced themselves that their own deep centuries-old divisions are just a creation of British propaganda. They passionately resent the suggestion that before receiving political power they should put their own house in order. Yet, at inter-Indian conferences, each section presses its own demands, and they fail utterly to reach agreement. So, India has met deadlock, and for the first time in the history of British rule, something like despair is possessing the minds of wise British and Indian lovers of the great subcontinent. Is there no hope? Is there no way to pick the lock of the deadlock? In Simla, in 1944, an event took place which may be the beginning of the new India. It was little heralded by the world press, but it was noted by the men of power and responsibility throughout the continent. Gandhi, in his ashram, heard of it. So did the Viceroy in his palace. News of it reached the grey-stoned Indian Office building in Westminster. It was hailed by one of the greatest living authorities on the Indian problem as an event unparalleled in Indian history, indeed in any history. This event immediately concerned Burma, the rich province which was secured to the British Crown by Lord Randolph Churchill in 1886. It was an action taken by a minority, the Anglo-Burmans, the people of mixed British and Burmese blood. In the old Burma, before the Japs came, this minority had been intensely jealous of the privileges and safeguards according to it by the British government. It felt the safeguards were the only bulwark against the Burmese majority, who resented the superiority they felt the Anglo-Burmans assumed towards them. Now the leaders of the Anglo-Burmans gathered in conference at Simla, recommended their community to give up all these safeguards and privileges. They wished, in future, to consider themselves a people of Burma and to rely for their security on the confidence and friendship of the Burmese people. Section after section of the Anglo-Burman community in India ratified this bold stand, the charter of an entire community on the give instead of on the get. Other Burmese communities were pricked to the heart. A Muslim barrister of the court of Rangoon gave the reactions of the Indian minority in Burma, after stating that the Indians' attitude as a community and as individuals had on occasions been wrong. He said, "If all the ability and labor we Indians have shown in getting is to be turned to giving, Burma will regard her Indians as a precious asset." The Indian barrister added, "I would like to see the Indian community voluntarily give up its claim to separate electorates and to special safeguards. If the motive of every community is to give rather than to get, who then would want any safeguards? Unless we can secure the confidence and goodwill of the Burmese people, paper safeguards can be nullified any day. Goodwill and friendship should be of greater and more lasting value than the temporarily economic advantages." Another leader of the Indian minority, a Hindu— what's a Hindu? Lay eggs. That's a joke. A Hindu headmaster commented, "We need to go into the new Burma to work for the welfare of Burma primarily and not for her exploitation. We need a new leadership of those who are prepared to serve, to give, to help, and not of those who want to amass, to hoard, and to carry back to India. How shall I make Burma great? Should be the question asked, not what shall my community gain?" Meanwhile, the Karens— 1945. Meanwhile, the Karens, the largest minority of Burma, declared that in future they intended to work with the majority, which they had always preferred to avoid. What was the Burmese reaction to all this? It is given in a remarkable document which has come into my hands, written by a man regarded as one of the leading Burmans of the day. "I can conceive of no better contribution to the making of a Burma that works," this Burman states, "than what has been done by the Anglo-Burmans. A lead has been given by Burma to the world on the question of minority communities, and it may well be that the Anglo-Burman conference at Simla made not only a declaration, but history. My emotions at this change of heart evinced by two important minority communities of Burma were at first elation and gratitude, but these have now been followed by an overwhelming sense of responsibility. It will now be my privilege to evoke a true response from the Burmans, and I have not the slightest doubt that the Burmans will respond in a like spirit of generosity and trust." How did all this happen? What was the cause of this series of events in which many see the hope not only for a new Burma, but for a new India also? The answer lies in the secret of change. These minority and majority leaders of Burma had met changed Englishmen walking about on two legs. These men were different from the usual idea of an Englishman, for they had decided that the way to the heart of India's problem was a change of heart, starting with a change in themselves. As soon as they began to change, they proved the truth of the great Lord Sinha's advice to the Lloyd George War Cabinet. Always remember, Indians are the most responsive people on earth. Indians, Burmans, Karens warmed to these men. Here were people they could say things to which they had never said to any Englishman. Here were people who not only believed in them, but expected the best from them, who were concerned that all Britons should live to make the Burmans great. These English were not blind to the Burmans' need for change. Indeed, they saw right through them, but they had the insight to live the statesmanship of being the first to change. There sprang up a new comradeship, a teamwork which introduced a new factor into the most insoluble of problems. The Burmans suddenly saw that the difference between communities could become not a cause of weakness and confusion, but a force to unite and enrich the nation. What was true between Karens and Burmans, they now sensed could be true between Burmans and British. A leading Burmese nationalist... Two glasses of wine, folks. A leading Burmese nationalist wrote, "Whatever the future of Burma may be, there will be room in it for the selfless Briton who comes to give of his best to her. In her path towards dominion status, she will need the help of Great Britain. Burmans of intelligence, give this tribute to Great Britain. If Burma must be under tutelage for a short period before attaining full self-government, she would rather be under British tutelage than any other tutelage, and when we have achieved our freedom, we would prefer to be an equal partner in the British Commonwealth of Nations than an independent country on our own." So, the simple conception of change is today producing the new statesmanship which cures imperial problems instead of merely shelving them or shoveling them out of sight. It offers a fresh alternative to the materialistic dilemma of exploit or evacuate. It provides a third way to Indians faced by the equally materialistic dilemma, hate or submit. It solves the problems of relationships and could change either staying or going for both British and Indian from tragedy into triumph. This cold and superior attitude is felt not only by Indians, but by Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, men from the colonies, and not less by Americans. It is the greatest single barrier to our working with anyone else. We call it reserve, and are rather proud of it. Others look upon it as a large-scale conceit. We find it hard to believe that other nations do not see us always as we see ourselves, the best, finest, truest people on earth. Sometimes we think of ourselves as the mother country, so we might remember the story of the wise mother who had a large family of children. If one of her children was troublesome, she gave him a dose of Epsom salts, but on days when all of them seemed troublesome to her, she took the dose of Epsom salts herself. When the mother country gives a lead in the spirit of change, the response is immediate. Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, when Premier of the Punjab, declared publicly that the spirit of change in the beacon light Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, when Premier of the Punjab, declared publicly that the spirit of change is the beacon light in a dark world, that MRA holds the only answer to the problems of India. Mr. Curtin, Prime Minister of Australia, at the time when his country was threatened by a Japanese invasion, in a national broadcast, called his people to rearm morally as the surest foundation of national strength and unity for the tasks of war as well as of peace. Lord Bennett, as Prime Minister of Canada, declared that the work of the Oxford Group in that dominion made the task of government easier. We need a change of heart in our approach to every imperial problem, and many await solution. There is the question of Australia's population. Who is to fill those vast empty spaces, if they are to be filled? There is the question of New Zealand's isolation from her friends and close to potential enemies. There are innumerable problems, not least of them the fact that in the last few years and under the immense pressures of war, many colonies and dominions have undergone the transformation which the Industrial Revolution brought to Britain, the changeover from an agricultural to a manufacturing community. There are the racial questions of South Africa and Canada, but India remains the key to our empire's future. If by a change of heart we find solutions to the problems of that vast subcontinent, we shall find solutions for every other part of empire and world relationship. India is recognized by the subversive forces of materialism as the keystone of our whole imperial edifice. So they concentrate the main strength of their divisive tactics upon it, endeavouring to stir up unrest between the various people of India and Britain. Nearly finished, gang. Nearly finished. Also, they use their own version of British administration in India as a major lever in their efforts to separate the United States from Britain. India is the link between East and West. Western civilization will be judged by the Eastern world in the future as in the past according to the success or failure of its regime in India. Also, India offers the West the chance of learning all the lessons the Eastern world has to teach us, and which for generations we have been too proud to learn. India may divide or unite the United Nations. With a new inspired philosophy of empire, Britain can win the heart not only of India, but of China and the gratitude of the whole world. It is Britain's opportunity for greatness. A new world will come about through a change of heart in men and nations. It will not happen any other way. And if Britain sets the pace of change, she will, in a fresh and stirring way, capture the hearts and imaginations not only of the citizens of her own far-flung dominions and colonies, but also of many another land. So the Commonwealth can become the pathfinder for the unity of the world. It can be a pattern for the unity of all free nations, and go forward to fulfill a great destiny, with many friends in the leadership of all mankind. Speaking of this task, the Earl of Athlone said, "Throughout her long history, this country never failed, and has not failed now, to meet recurrent crises with the courage which each demanded. But the spiritual crisis remains and calls for action. Nation and empire must stand or fall by our response to that call. The choice is moral rearmament or national decay. That choice will decide whether ours is ultimately to go the way of other dead kingdoms and empires, or whether our Commonwealth, led by God, may become a leader of the world towards sanity and peace." Well, that's the end of chapter 18. Thank you for bearing with me, because I was in a slightly delicate state, very slightly. Love to hear from you in the comments below. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. And I shall see you, please God and His Blessed Mother, tomorrow for chapter 19, The House with a Home Inside It. I bet you can't wait.